There's a strange kind of silence that settles in when your friends start to succeed and you don't. You scroll through social media or join an old friend's dinner party, and suddenly you're surrounded by stories of promotions, home purchases, startup launches, and wedding announcements. You smile, you nod, you celebrate them, because you truly are happy for them. But something still tugs quietly at your chest. It's not jealousy. Not quite. It's more like wondering when it will be your turn. You've been working hard too. You've made sacrifices, stayed up late, kept showing up. But your timeline doesn't look like theirs. You're not lost, but you're not exactly there yet either. So you begin to ask yourself, am I falling behind? In those moments, something deeper is triggered. You start forming beliefs about success, about your worth, about where you should be by now. And the thing is, how you respond to your friend's success when you're still waiting for your own says a lot about the belief system you carry underneath. Let me show you 3 very different responses, 3 people, each shaped by a different belief, and how each path leads to a completely different emotional outcome. Daniel was 28 when he saw the post that broke him. A former college friend, someone he used to pull all-nighters with, someone who once asked him for help on design software, had just been hired by Google. The caption read, "Dreams do come true. Never stop believing." Daniel stared at the screen for a long time, not because he wasn't happy for his friend, but because for a split second, something collapsed inside him. At the time, Daniel was freelancing as a graphic designer. His projects came in wavesome. Months were busy, others were painfully quiet. He had skill, yes. Clients liked him. But there was no company badge, no corporate ladder, no big moment to announce to the world, just quiet work and quieter self-doubt. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he began scrolling through more profiles, more wins, more announcements, more captions that said, "Hard work pays off." It was the phrase, "pays off," that lingered. Because Daniel had worked hard too, but somehow it hadn't paid off in the way the world seemed to recognize. And in the silence of his studio apartment, that thought festered into something toxic. If they're succeeding, then I must be failing. This belief, though unspoken, began to shape how Daniel saw the world. Each achievement from someone else wasn't just neutral, it felt like a scoreboard. A reminder that he was losing in a game he didn't even realize he was playing. Worse, he started pulling away from the people he cared about. Not because they made him feel bad, but because he couldn't stand feeling small next to them. Every conversation became a quiet comparison. Every question, "So what are you working on these days?" felt like a spotlight on his uncertainty. Daniel told himself it was just a phase, that he'd catch up eventually. But in the meantime, he avoided reunions, turned down invites, and began shrinking not in talent, but in self-worth. What he didn't realize was how deeply this belief was rooted in a zero-sum mindset. The idea that there's only so much success to go around, that if someone else wins, your chances get smaller. It's a belief many of us carry from childhood, rewarded for being first, best, fastest, conditioned to compare test scores, college acceptances, job titles. No one told us that life is not a racetrack but a landscape, and we don't all bloom at the same time. But Daniel couldn't see that yet. To him, success felt like a rapidly closing door, and he hadn't made it through in time. This kind of thinking is painful. It doesn't motivate, it isolates. You begin to measure your days by someone else's highlight reel. You stop celebrating others because you've forgotten how to celebrate yourself. And here's the most dangerous part. When you believe that someone else's win is your loss, you also begin to believe that your worth is conditional, that you only matter when you've made it. Daniel started waking up with dread, not because he hated his work, but because he hated feeling invisible. He kept waiting for the big moment that would finally prove he belonged. But the longer it didn't come, the more convinced he became that he never would. And that's how people start to spiral, not because life is unfair, but because their belief about what success means begins to harden. And when it hardens, it defines them, but not everyone sees it this way. Some people faced with the same feelings choose a different path, not through comparison, but through trust, not in outcomes, but in timing. Let me introduce you to Melody. Her journey couldn't be more different, because her belief was never about racing others. It was about understanding that life has seasons, and she happened to be in a different one. Let's see what that looked like. Unlike Daniel, Melody didn't feel like she was running a race. At 31, she had seen enough of life's unpredictability to stop believing in straight lines. She worked as a senior editor at a small but respected literary magazine. It wasn't glamorous. The office was cramped, the hours were long, and the pay was modest. But she loved words, and she loved shaping stories. That, to her, already felt like a kind of wealth. Still, there were days when the silence crept in, especially when another wedding invite arrived in the mail, or when her group chat lit up with news that someone had bought their second investment property, or when she logged onto Instagram and saw baby photos wrapped in soft blankets under captions that said, "This is what happiness looks like." It wasn't that Melody didn't want those things. It's just that her life hadn't unfolded that way. There had been a broken engagement in her mid-20s, a relocation across states, a year of unemployment when the magazine almost shut down. Through it all, she had chosen to stay close to what felt meaningful even when it didn't look impressive from the outside. Her friends didn't mean to make her feel behind. They were kind, thoughtful, and often told her how lucky she was to be doing what she loved. But some nights, even kindness couldn't quiet the whispers. "You're 31. Shouldn't you be further along by now? Why is everyone moving ahead and you're still here?" The difference was, Melody didn't believe those whispers. She had grown up close to her grandmother, a gardener who taught her something profound without ever intending to. Some flowers bloom in spring, others in autumn, but all of them are beautiful when they're ready. That stayed with her. It became her quiet compass. So instead of measuring life by milestones, Melody measured it by presence. Instead of chasing validation, she cultivated depth. She celebrated the small things, the quiet of early mornings, a sentence that finally clicked, the joy of editing a piece that would go on to touch someone else's heart. Her definition of success had less to do with speed and more to do with alignment. And that belief changed everything. She wasn't immune to doubt. She wasn't perfectly content every day. But she didn't rush herself. And that meant she could be genuinely happy for her friends because their paths weren't a threat to hers. They were just different. This belief everyone blooms in their own time is both liberating and difficult. It requires patience in a world that rewards urgency. It asks you to stay grounded when everything around you says, "Hurry up." But it's also a belief that builds resilience. Because when you trust your own timeline, you stop needing constant proof. You begin to walk your path with quiet confidence, even when it doesn't come with applause. And that's what Melody did. She didn't announce much on social media. She didn't compare job titles or salaries. but she built a life that felt whole. Not perfect, not polished, but real. And that groundedness became her strength. Still, not everyone can slow down like Melody. Some people, when faced with the same pressure, go the other way. They take the success of their friends not as comparison, but as a challenge. They turn it into fuel, into fire. They decide they must catch up no matter what it costs. Let me introduce you to someone like that. His name is Ethan, and his story takes a very different turn. Ethan wasn't falling behind because he didn't allow himself the option. At 27, he worked in tech sales, not exactly his dream job, but one with clear goals, measurable outcomes, and generous bonuses. For Ethan, success wasn't abstract. It was tangible. Quarterly targets, performance reviews, LinkedIn metrics. And that's exactly how he liked it. Ever since college, Ethan had equated effort with progress. If someone else was doing better, the answer was simple: outwork them. More hours, more skills, more grind. He wasn't bitter, just fiercely determined. So when a close friend landed a $2 million seed round for his startup, Ethan didn't get jealous. He got activated. He rewrote his entire schedule the next day. No more sleeping past 6 a.m. No more idle weekends. Lunch breaks turned into learning sessions. Nights became strategy deep dives. He enrolled in an online MBA without telling anyone. Quiet hustle, he called it. To outsiders, Ethan looked focus-driven, even admirable. But inside, something else was happening. His ambition wasn't just about growth, it was about catching up. Because underneath all that drive, Ethan carried an unspoken fear. What if I never make it? He didn't resent his friends. He admired them. But their success became a mirror that reflected everything he thought he hadn't done yet. And that reflection kept him running. Every time someone shared an accomplishment, Ethan turned up the volume on his productivity. But with each sprint forward, he grew more disconnected from rest, from joy, from himself. He started measuring his worth not just by what he had achieved, but by how hard he was trying to achieve more. There was no room for stillness. He stopped going to concerts, skipped family dinners, ghosted on vacations. Not because he didn't care about people, but because he didn't believe he had time. He told himself, once I've made it, I'll relax. I just need to push a little longer. But the finish line kept moving. There was always another milestone, another someone doing more. Ethan was winning in numbers, but slowly unraveling in spirit. He couldn't sit in silence without guilt. He couldn't take a walk without a podcast. Even journaling became another task to optimize. And somewhere along the way, he forgot what he was chasing in the first place. Was it success? Security? Approval? Or just the hope that if he ran fast enough, the fear would finally quiet down? This is the paradox of the hustle mindset. It looks like control, but it's often fueled by anxiety. It promises achievement, but sometimes robs you of the ability to feel it. Ethan believed that falling behind was the ultimate failure. So he ran it toward joy, but away from shame. And that belief, though invisible, drove every decision. He didn't slow down, not until his body forced him toward a panic attack that landed him in the ER, heart racing, chest tight, convinced he was having a stroke. The doctors said he was healthy. They told him he needed rest. But rest wasn't part of his vocabulary. Until that moment, Ethan had never considered that his urgency was a form of fear, that his productivity was a mask for feeling not enough, not lazy, not weak, just exhausted. From chasing a version of success that kept moving faster than he could run. There was no villain in Ethan's story. No toxic boss, no bad childhood. Just a belief that if he didn't stay ahead, he'd disappear. And that belief pushed him harder than any boss ever could. So now we've seen three very different responses to the same situation. Daniel shrank away from connection. Melody trusted her path. Ethan raced until he couldn't desist. Three people, three beliefs, all shaped by how they made sense of one thing: being behind. But which belief helps us grow and which one quietly breaks us? Let's take a step back, because in the next part, we'll look at the emotional weight behind these beliefs and what they reveal about how we measure worth. Three people, three beliefs, three completely different emotional outcomes. Daniel internalized the success of others as proof of his own failure. He didn't just feel behind, he felt lesser, unseen, unworthy. And that quiet erosion of self-worth made him retreat from connection, from opportunity, even from joy. Melody saw success differently. To her, life wasn't a linear path, it was a garden. She knew some seasons bloom later than others. And in trusting her own timeline, she made space for peace. Not perfect peace, but one that didn't rely on comparison. Then there was Ethan, the one who turned pressure into progress until it broke him. His belief in relentless self-improvement gave him short-term wins, but long-term burnout. The very engine that pushed him forward also kept him from resting, from being, from feeling like he was ever enough. And this brings us to a bigger truth. It's not the situation that shapes us, but the story we tell ourselves about it. All three faced the same moment watching others succeed while still waiting for their own. But the meaning they gave that moment changed everything. So what belief do you carry when life feels slow and everyone else seems miles ahead? Do you turn inward and shrink? Do you trust that your time will come? Or do you run faster, hoping the noise will quiet down if you just keep moving? Maybe, at some point, we've all been each of them. But in the end, it's not about keeping pace with others. It's about recognizing what pace belongs to me. And from that place of clarity, real success begins. Because success isn't always visible. Sometimes, it's simply the courage to stay true to your path. Now, let's bring it all together. Because this isn't just about Daniel, Melody, or Ethan. It's about what happens next when we stop comparing, stop racing, and start redefining what it means to move forward. Let's close with that. There will always be someone ahead of you, someone younger who's already made it, someone older who seems to have it all figured out, someone who moves faster, earns more, shines brighter. But here's the quiet truth we often forget. Success isn't a finish line. It's not a stage. It's not even a moment. It's a state of being, of living in alignment with who you are and what matters to you. Daniel's journey reminds us how easy it is to shrink under the weight of comparison. Melody shows us the strength of trusting our own rhythm. And Ethan reveals what can happen when ambition turns into urgency. Each story reflects a piece of us, and together they offer a deeper question. What would change if you stopped measuring your life against theirs? Maybe it's time to stop asking, "Am I behind?" and start asking, "Am I becoming someone I respect?" You're not late. You're not early. You're just on your way. In your time, in your way. If this video spoke to you, I hope you'll take a moment to like, comment, or share it with someone who might need this reminder too. And if you'd like to keep exploring these quiet questions with me, don't forget to subscribe. We're building something meaningful here, and your presence matters. In an upcoming video, we'll unpack another idea you've probably heard 100 times, but maybe, just maybe, you've never paused long enough to see what it's really saying. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. In a world full of noise, the fact that you paused here means more than you know. I hope something in this story spoke to you even just a little. That's more than enough. I'll see you in the next one.